Welcome back in many ways. We're running a series of weekly Fortuna Masterclasses, MBA Admissions Masterclasses, to guide you through the coming weeks and months of your very personal journey to the world's top business schools. Last week, we had a great session with my co-director, Judith Hadara from Wharton, from INSEAD. And we figured, we just moved under the 4-month mark to all of those round one deadlines. So there is a countdown. There is a clock that's ticking, or there are days that are moving off the calendar as we slowly move towards round one. And this is an extension. What you should be doing over those coming weeks, let's say we've got a little more than 100 days. And to break all of that down, we've prepared a number of slides, but most importantly, a great discussion with this wonderful team that I'm so very lucky to work with at Fortuna. I'm joined for today's masterclass by Bill Kooser. Bill is the former Associate Dean at Chicago Booth, and Sharon, Joyce, who was the former Associate Director of Admissions at Berkeley, Haas. Bill and Sharon, great to see you. We're looking calm, right? But maybe that's because it's not now 1st of September. We've still got a few weeks to go. And I think one of the things, Bill, that you'll be emphasizing is really how to optimize this sort of 3.5, 4-month runway and window that candidates have in front of them.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Matt, and welcome to everyone on the session today. We'll talk a bit about what does this time frame look like? How much time should you be spending on each element of your application? And try to give a sense of what should be happening when. As Matt mentioned, we like, in most cases, in the ideal situation, like to have 3 or 4 months to work with clients to prepare an outstanding application for any of the schools. So if you think about application deadlines coming in September, round one, now is the time to begin. And there are multiple elements to the process, and I break them down into 2 broad categories. One is kind of the thinking process, thinking about yourself, thinking about the schools that you might want to attend. And then there's the doing process, which is writing applications, getting your recommenders on board, thinking about your resume, that sort of thing. And both of those are obviously important, and both of those will take quite a bit of time. And I think Bill,
just
go ahead, Matt.
You've already placed the emphasis on outstanding applications, and of course that's what we're working with. And just quickly to also introduce Sharon, you'll also be talking, Sharon, about some of the things to really get into motion now. We'll be talking about recommenders that you need to identify, reach out to, all of these pieces of the puzzle that we'll be juggling over the coming weeks and months to be ready for those round one deadlines.
100%, 100%.
So just for context for everybody, Bill and Sharon are part of this wonderful team at Fortuna. I always refer to them as the dream team, and rightly so. Over the last 10 plus years, we've been able to draw extraordinary talent from the world's top business schools. It seemed very natural, of course, to want to bring together that sort of insider insight, individuals that were actually sitting in committee and talking about your profile, what made you such a strong candidate, and perhaps where you fit as these individuals were shaping the next incoming class. So as you can see on our slide, they represent the world's top business schools, all of the M7 top 10 schools from the US, and then several of the top international schools like INSEAD and London Business School. This webinar, I guess, is typical of the many, many resources that we have put together at Fortuna, including, of course, that one-on-one time that we really want to set aside with you. We ask you to send some background details, where you've worked, your academic path, if sharing a resume, because we meticulously go through that resume, and whether you've played piano to level community project that you've been involved in the last 18 months, how that might generate certain patterns. So we try to take a lot of care over what I think are probably the industry standard in terms of consultations to find out about your chances of heading to business school. So I mentioned my co-panelists for today and the level of insight. Bill and Sharon have already given us a taster of what to expect and how we've broken down each of those different elements to give you some real clarity, lots of great ideas and insights for sharing your story your accomplishments. Now, this is one in a series of masterclasses. It's every Wednesday at noon, East Coast time. So what does that make it? It's 9:30 in the evening in Mumbai. It must be about 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So wherever you're joining us from, or if you're catching this on YouTube in the following days and weeks, there's one more part of this masterclass next Wednesday, same time, with other Fortuna colleagues and lots more insight. But we'll get started. And I'm going to turn back to Bill in terms of what you should be doing and when, this overall time frame. Bill, in some ways dictated by the schools and the dates that they are starting to publish. Harvard has announced, I think it's going to be September the 8th. Now, you just do this in that long Labor Day weekend in early September. Why do you need so much time?
Sorry, some people do try to do it in that long Labor Day weekend. I wouldn't recommend it. We typically say, as we've said before, 3 to 4 months is an ideal time for preparing a great application. And why do you need so much time? A lot of the effort requires that you think very deeply about yourself, about your career plans, about what makes you tick, what your passions are, what your interests are, and then figure out how to tell your story to an application, to admissions committee, to convince them that you are a candidate that will do well at their school and that they will be proud to have as an alumnus. So that process of thinking about who you are and what you want to do takes quite a bit of time. And in general, as I said earlier, there are 2 phases. Then the one that takes the most time and is most difficult for many of our clients is the thinking phase, doing that self-reflection and doing that deep research on the schools that might be of interest to you. So we typically would say a month or 6 weeks in that process of doing the initial reflection, doing the school research to make sure that you've got those things lined up and that you know exactly what you're looking for, why a particular school is the right school for you, and what you can bring to the table as a candidate. After that, then you begin to get into the process of selecting and briefing your recommenders, crafting your resume, writing those essays, which again will take quite a bit of time. And some of those will happen simultaneously, concurrently. So it's not all a sequential process, but that deep reflection is really very important and will take more time than you think it's going to.
Right. Great place to get started. And Sharon, when we think about that time and the sort of reflection that Bill has described, I see that as a gift. You know, some applicants, of course, are worried about, you know, what does Berkeley want me to say, or, you know, how am I supposed to frame my story? But, you know, most applicants, whether it's 3, 4, 6, 7 years of professional experience, to be able to step back, you know, hold up that mirror and really think about a path that they've taken, and as Bill was describing, through this thinking process, it's a true gift to us to be able to put all of this thinking together.
I would agree with that. You know, it's interesting though too, Matt, a few days ago when Bill and I were just doing a little bit of a walkthrough about what we wanted to talk about today, I think he and I both agree though, we work with some exceptionally talented clients, but so many of them have just been on this trajectory of success. If you think of about like a hamster wheel almost of just achieving, whether academically or professionally. So again, to have some time to be able to step back a little bit before starting to write essays is a gift that I think sometimes our clients don't even realize until, you know, they've gone through the whole process. They've, you know, obviously are very happy to have been able to achieve acceptance to, you know, hopefully a number of schools. But we also hear from our clients just how much they enjoyed the process, to really think very concretely about what are your career goals? What do you want to do? How are your career goals aligned with the schools that you're going to be specifically targeting? Thinking about why an MBA in a very concrete way. What are some of the classes that you know are really going to add to your foundation? What are the classes you're really excited about? Some professors who you are looking forward to learning from? Thinking about some of the co-curricular activities, getting involved in some of the different clubs and activities, thinking about the community that you're going to be joining. So kind of reflecting on all of those mechanics around why an MBA. And then I think too, I think we also have a lot of really modest clients. And I think one of the strengths of working with a coach is having someone who can really help you take a look at the impact that you've had, whether that's something in the past, whether that's something that you are currently working on, of which you're justifiably proud, or an impact that you really want to make in the future. And so I think, just again, we keep talking about this, but stepping back a little bit before you go forward is definitely what will help you be more successful, because schools want to know with some specificity around what your career goals are. Are they aligned with their program? Is it something that's doable? They want to see that you have put effort into showing why you would be a great fit for their program in terms of how your career goals are aligned with what they can offer you at their school. And then in terms of the impact piece as well, schools want students who are driven, students who are going to go on and make a difference in the world. And so, again, having some plan to get all of this done, over Labor Day weekend, you're really going to shortchange yourself on this kind of whole journey as it's unfolding when you're on the path to applying for a top MBA program. So don't sacrifice that.
Right.
Really kind of revel in that, because it's not often that we get to take some time to really be very thoughtful and very targeted about what we want to do.
Right. Well, if we've done all of that lead-up work, then we can enjoy the Labor Day weekend. But I'm glad that you've both placed that emphasis on enjoying this process. Now, that said, of course, data sufficiency, critical reasoning, that integral part of the GMAT. One of our viewers has just asked us the question. I hope there are lots of questions to come and we can handle them as we go, and certainly at the end. But Bill, our attendees asking if that sort of 3 to 4 month time frame that we're now looking at round one includes preparation for the GMAT or the GRE. It would have been great if we'd taken care of this in our senior year of college, but do you think it's realistic to do both?
Ideally, you would have done the GMAT preparation prior to this process, but we have many clients who are doing GMAT prep concurrently with the reflection piece. So it can be done. It won't allow you to dive as deeply into either one as you might if you were doing them separately, but it is possible. And probably the majority of our clients are preparing for either their first GMAT attempt or perhaps a second or third attempt as they're beginning this process. Again, it would be ideal to have that GMAT done, out of the way, taken care of, not have to worry about it anymore before you get into the deep reflection and research process. But in most cases, that does not happen, and that you're working on thinking about the GMAT at the same time you're thinking about yourself and where you want to go with your career. And so it's just a matter of a little bit of time management then.
Do you think there's a sense, Bill, because of course the deeper we get into the applications, that level of motivation, the excitement about school, do you think it can actually then carry someone through as they're thinking, sorry, why am I preparing for the GMAT? I mean, it actually maybe gives the added incentive and reminder of why they're doing this.
I suppose it can provide some motivation. Hopefully that motivation existed before, as they're deciding that, yes, indeed, I want to go to get an MBA, and that you have a pretty good sense of the fact that this is the right move for you in your career. But yeah, the two can kind of jointly feed one another. But again, the preparation for GMAT and the preparation of the reflection school research are significantly different, that you've got to be able to compartmentalize and think differently about those two efforts. And they may complement one another depending on how your brain works, or they may kind of distract you. It just depends on the client.
Right, so we'll be looking at those different components and everything that you are organizing over the next 3 months. And you know, how much do you want this? I mean, this is your future. You're investing in yourselves. So, you know, putting together the applications, working with recommenders, there's GMAT or GRE prep on top of it, perhaps looking at your work schedule and saying over the next 3-4 months, how can I carve as much time aside to really be able to do the sort of outreach and other guidance that my co-panelists are sharing? Sharon, one final comment perhaps on self-reflection, remembering, of course, that at Fortuna, I mean, I think that we've worked with clients from over 130 countries around the world. I remember speaking to a lovely young man from the Solomon Islands. That was the first. there are many sort of processes, even applying to undergrad and university, let alone grad school, where it's all been based on academics and grades. And this emphasis on self-reflection really is very distinct for business schools, recognizing that perhaps you're 3-4 years out of college.
And I think that that's sometimes it does come as a surprise. I think when some clients for the first time look at some of the essay prompts and they're like, wait, Haas wants to know what makes me feel alive and why, or Stanford wants to know what matters most to me and why. Again, I think that it's easy-ish for the schools to discern whether you can do the work on paper. They can look at scores, they can look at your grades, they can read your letters of recommendation, but they also, as I said earlier, they're looking to bring in a class of unique individuals who really do want to do some great things in the world. So in terms of that self-reflective piece, being able to show how you are this unique individual who is going to very much add to the fabric of that program is something that the schools definitely are looking for. Because again, the MBA experience too is also different in the sense that you're not just thinking about those 2 years while you're at Berkeley Haas or at Chicago Booth, but also beyond. How are you going to be also a key alumni at these schools, helping to keeping on supporting the mission of that MBA program, giving back, coming back as a panelist, things like that. So again, the self-reflection piece is not something that I think will just happen overnight. I think that it unfolds. One thing we do with our clients, we have a couple different exercises and activities that really get at that. We have a whole career visioning curriculum that we use. We have a leadership skills worksheet, if you will, that we go through with our clients. I'm also cross-trained in something called Clifton Strengths that I use with my clients, just to be sure that before we start working on the strategy for essay writing, that our clients, again, have given themselves that time and space to really think about how they want to put themselves out there and their positioning and their branding, if you will. If you think about yourself as a commodity and how that's going to appeal to the different schools for which you plan to apply.
Now, Bill, with the wonderful career that you enjoyed at Chicago Booth over 20 years. I defy anybody to know Chicago Booth better than you, but our candidates, of course, are looking so closely, not just at Booth, but at other top schools. In fact, it reflects one of the questions Kima has written in and said, how does this sort of time frame work if I'm considering 4, 5, maybe 6 schools, which in the case. So take us through sort of school research and almost the dialogue of finding fit and the sort of things to then explore and discover about these wonderful institutions.
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is that make sure you're not just looking at a rankings table and picking those schools as the ones you want to apply for. The rankings table may inform some of your decision, but we find too many clients that start out with, here are the 6 schools I want to apply to. They are the top 6 on such and such a ranking. And then when you get in deeper and say, well, why those schools? What is it about those schools you like? They really can't answer that question. And that is typically a very important part of an application, explaining why a particular school is a good fit for you. So we do want our clients to go much, much deeper into the school research than simply looking at a rankings table. And that consists of thinking about what is your career goal from that reflection piece, and how is this particular school or set of schools going to support you in that career goal? Do they have particular classes or particular faculty members that emphasize or work in the areas that you're particularly interested in? Are there special programs that you're interested in? Maybe you have an interest in international business. Is there an opportunity for you to spend time abroad? Is there, perhaps if you're interested in social entrepreneurship or nonprofit, is there a program that devotes itself to those ideas? So thinking a little more deeply about the curriculum at the schools, looking at the course titles, looking at the course descriptions, looking at the faculty members and the research, will give you a sense of whether that school will provide the academic foundation for what it is you want to do in your career. Should also be looking at what is the atmosphere, the culture of the school. And even if you're looking strictly at the top 10 or 15 schools, the cultures are all very different. And in these days of COVID, it's much harder to get a sense of the culture and the fit, the personality, if you will, of the schools, but it is still possible to do so. And it's an important element of whether you're going to enjoy the experience. And you're going to spend 2 years and a lot of money at a place to get a very, very good education, but you want to have a good time there too. You want to feel that the style of teaching is appropriate for you, that the kinds of people that the school attracts are people that you want to get to know and develop and have as part of your network. So doing things to get a better handle on the school culture, I think, are very important. And that would include, if possible, visits to the school, but certainly conversations with students and alumni from that institution. And you can do that. One of the things we typically suggest is go on the websites, find out who are the student leaders of the clubs that you might be interested in. So it might be the investment banking club, or if you're a military veteran, the veterans club, or the social impact club, and see if you can get hold of those folks, talk to them about their experience, talk to them about what they liked, what they didn't like about the school, and try to get a sense from that how the school is going to fit your own particular interests and approaches. Should also make sure that you're signed up for any webinars, information sessions, visits, special lectures that the school might offer, again, to kind of get a sense of whether there's a good fit and whether you are going to appreciate the approach that the school takes. And in the application itself, there will be times when you are going to be asked to talk about why you want this school, why this school is an appropriate fit for you, whether in the essays or in an interview when it comes to that. And you want to be able to talk specifically about particular courses, particular faculty members, particular programs, particular elements of the location, perhaps, of the school itself. And add those into your application. So it's not simply, it's a great school, it's got great faculty, it's high up on the rankings table, therefore I want to go. You need to be much more specific about that. This all takes some time. We recommend that you start pretty soon, but that process with the conversations with students, with the potential visits, that can take you through the entire 3 or 4 months you've got before you actually hit that submit button. So it's a long process.
I have 2 questions for you. One, as a former senior MBA admissions at one of the top schools, could you tell when a candidate had really taken the time to get to know your school? And also, with Bill's suggestion to reach out to club presidents, so perhaps that second-year student that, given the way that they're contributing beyond the classroom, there's a great match with some of the ideas and energy that you're looking to share. So could you tell? And perhaps just the fact that it can be a handful of conversations. This is not a popularity contest. You don't have to speak to 27 Haas MBAs before you apply. But as Bill said, choose those people carefully because they're going to be very insightful discussions.
Yeah, you can definitely tell as an admissions officer whether somebody has done the research or whether they've simply looked at the website and pulled a few things off. They'll have a much deeper understanding of what really makes the school tick. So for example, whenever there's a candidate who's interested in Booth, I say, make sure you understand Booth's philosophy of education, this whole idea of the Chicago approach to education. And every school has kind of an underlying philosophy of what they believe about business school education. You need to understand that and why it's important to the school and why it would be important to you. So very clearly you can tell. And you're right, Matt, you don't have to spend hours and hours talking to every possible person you get hold of, but talking to 1 or 2 or 3 people to kind of get a good sense and a good conversation going will be very, very useful as you begin those applications themselves.
Sharon, Tijas has written in and said, how many students or alums should I speak to? And should I mention their names in the essays and application questions? I mean, when a school has a 400 or 500 word deadline to list, Pauline Smith, class of 2017, takes up a lot of time and room. So what would your advice be on that?
I think that a clever way of getting to that, though, would be mentioning, gee, every time I talked to a Haas alum, this was the sentiment, or this was the feeling that I got, or this was a common thread, to show that you've had a conversation maybe with more than one person. And I think, though, and I think Bill said this too, I think it's important to definitely reach out, but not to the point of overkill. We once had a prospective student who emailed every single one of our student ambassadors with the same 20 questions, and it was overkill. It did not bode well for that applicant because it showed this kind of odd lack of judgment. Most schools in some form or fashion have a team of student ambassadors, which you are welcome to correspond with, same with club leadership. But I would be very selective in terms of communicating maybe with, 2 or 3 current students with whom you would have a natural affinity, folks who are interested in the same things you're interested in, perhaps someone who went to the same undergraduate institution as you. And similar with alumni too. You don't want to spam the entire world. You don't want to start stalking too many people on LinkedIn, but be very purposeful in terms of what you want to learn about that specific school and how those folks can serve as resources. In terms of name dropping, again, getting back to what Matt just said, the word counts are very tight in a lot of the essays that you're not going to be able to give a laundry list of everyone who you have talked to. But certainly when schools do have maybe short answers where they've asked, for specific names, I think if you've had a few conversations back and forth, I think it's fine to mention the folks who you've talked to by name.
Right. Well, I suppose we'll switch because there's all of this research that we're doing at the schools. And now we'll think about how they're assessing us as applicants. And we're going to start with what is perhaps one of the first documents, the pieces of the puzzle that schools look at, the resume. Now, which of the two of you would like to tackle this? And of course, my first question, do you start down at the bottom, all of that fun extracurricular stuff, or do you sort of work your way down? How does it work with the schools as they assess your resume?
Bill, do you want to hop on first for this?
Sure. I'll jump in, and then Sharon, you can join as well. So we actually, one of the things that that Fortuna does very, very well is provide some really good guidance on creating all of these elements of your application. And we have some wonderful templates for how to craft a resume for business school purposes. And you should recognize that a business school resume, application resume, may be different than a resume you might use for a job search. So take a close look at those templates if you end up working with us. But the key things we want to get across in this resume is highlight the accomplishments that you've had, the impact you've had either at your workplace, at your academic institution, or outside of the workplace. If you're deeply involved in extracurriculars, deeply involved in social or community activism, you want to show that impact as much as you can, and you want to show leadership wherever possible. So if you've managed people, if you've supervised people, if you have founded a company or founded a nonprofit, try to get those things into the resume, and we work really closely with clients to help them do that. We also have on staff a resume coach who will be brought in to kind of do a final pass on everybody's resume to make sure that it is up to snuff and conveys all of the information that you want to convey. So the resume consists of, 3 key areas. One is your professional experience, the second is your educational background, and the third is everything else. And the everything else can be actually a very important part. Some people think of that as kind of the throwaway, I'll fill out a little space in the bottom of the resume. But a lot of that everything else stuff comes up in interviews. Certainly when I was doing interviews years ago, that would be where I'd start. I'd like to learn a little bit more about the candidate and why they were engaged with particular sport, or what brought them to found the nonprofit that they founded, or what kind of travel had they done around the world. So those elements are important, but clearly you're going to focus much of your time on the professional experience that you bring, the leadership, the impact, the activities you've been engaged in at work, and then highlighting some of the key things from your academic experience as well. And we try to do all of that in one page, which sometimes is difficult, and we work very closely with our clients to do that.
And then, of course, Jody, who spent the last 15 years putting together the resumes of Wharton MBAs, and also how she brings that to applications for business school. So, I mean, we have on Fortuna's resources, I think, entire webinars dedicated to the resume. Maybe, Sharon, there are just a couple of areas that I would like to sort of pick out for today's webinar. One is maybe this idea of patterns. You know, Bill said, looking down in that third area of other commitments that you've had, maybe beyond your academic community and your education, beyond the different professional institutions that you've worked with, and how we might see things in that third area that actually sort of demonstrate behaviors, how in each of these different chapters of your life, your impact in your community, academic and professional, you know, you as an admissions officer like to be able to join those dots, right? And what it says about the characteristics of an individual.
Yes, for sure. And I'm sorry, Matt, did you say specifically about like putting things in like patents? Is that what I heard?
Patterns. I mean,
Patterns.
if you've got a
Okay.
to your name too, that would be good, but patterns of behavior.
Okay. Well, I think by and large, you know, there are a lot of industries that tend to be feeders into MBA programs, right? So consulting, we get a lot of engineers, a lot of people in finance. And so I think it's that other section that can be another place for you to shine, maybe to share something that is unexpected, maybe a way to share something that will complement later, something about your career goals. You know, if you're talking about wanting to work in an underserved area and you mentioned a study abroad program that you did that was in service to a community or a group, again, that is the pattern in terms of making sure that it seems like there's this seamless story that's been happening throughout your life and why these dots are connecting and are aligning in a proper way. And I think too, and I would agree with Bill, you know, I would usually start with the other section because that's where I usually would find something that was sort of a conversation starter versus jumping right into a bullet, like tell me about, you know, the 3 million you saved for X, Y, and Z corporation. The other section is a place where there are conversation starters around your community service involvement. Again, something that you might have excelled at, like a sport. I worked with a client who circumnavigated all by himself in a sailboat around Croatian islands. So just something really unique too about yourself that also shows that you're someone who is very interesting, someone who does unique things in the world up and beyond what you just do in a professional setting. And so I do think that that's important to bring into the resume as well. And I think sometimes our clients can sometimes struggle with the one page, but I think that once you work with your coach as well as with our resume expert, a lot of things are not necessary in the one page resume for a business school, cutting away some of the jargon, maybe things that are just overly technical because you're wasting space speaking in jargon, speaking too technically, and you're not able to actually show results, which is what the resume should be reflecting. So does that help, Matt?
It does. And with the example that you gave, I mean, it sounds wonderful to sail solo around the Mediterranean, Croatia, and elsewhere. But if in the resume it simply said in sort of hobbies and interests, and somebody has written in, if you just said sailing, that's fairly
Or
flat.
travel.
Whereas the example that you gave strikes me that it is that icebreaker, and we've just got that added element of adventure that tells us something a little bit more about the applicant. So is that what we're trying to achieve?
Exactly. I mean, initially the bullet they had was traveling. I'm like, well, what does that mean though? Can you tell me about a time you did something really cool, really unique? And then, you know, again, I feel like a lot of our clients are really modest. And then when this story came out about how he single-handedly did this, I was like, oh my gosh, that is awesome. That's really neat. Let's put that on your resume. And for sure, it was a conversation starter when he was invited to interview.
Right. Bill, before we leave resumes, one final question, and a lot of clients sort of start with this quandary, how they share leadership opportunities that they've had. You know, maybe it's not reflected in a job title, but there are many, many ways to be able to show the many different facets of leadership in different parts of your resume.
Sure. So lots of different things. So it might be managing a project, leading a project. You know, the traditional leadership role is a managerial role, and not everyone applying to business school, certainly full-time programs, has had much direct managerial responsibility, and admissions committees know that. But you may have managed a project. You may have had other members of a team that you're working with. Even if they don't officially report to you, you've had some responsibility for allocating their work and evaluating what they're doing. You may have had leadership roles outside of your professional experience. Maybe while you were in college, you were an officer in a student club or a fraternity. It may be that you are very engaged in a nonprofit with leadership responsibilities there, perhaps on a young board of directors role, for example. You might also show leadership by your initiative. So promoting a new idea within your company. It may not be people management, but it still demonstrates leadership. You may be mentoring other people. Again, providing evidence that you have created something new, demonstrated some initiative, pushed back perhaps, or advocated for something that was new and different within your company. All of those are elements of leadership that can be promoted through the resume.
Now, there are other voices involved in all of this, and often moving from the resume, the next step for the admissions office is to look at recommendations. Most of the top schools require 2 recommenders. In a handful of cases, that's gone down now just to 1. So I suppose the basics, Sharon, who are we targeting in terms of supervisors, employers? What if I'm self-employed? Who are we looking for, and what are we looking for them to share?
So for sure, schools want to see letters of recommendation from those who have supervised or managed you in some capacity. And sometimes that is tricky if you are self-employed or if you work for a family business. Never ever though submit letters of recommendation from a family member. It's kind of a kiss of death, and highly we would not suggest that at all. What we have done is we will have clients then submit letters of recommendation potentially from a client, someone who maybe they've partnered with on a project, things like that. All of the schools in some form or fashion do have a section where you can explain how you chose the folks who are providing letters of recommendation on your behalf. And sometimes we do have clients who are not comfortable asking their current immediate supervisor because they might not feel comfortable disclosing at this point in time that they are planning to leave to go to business school, if that might jeopardize some of the opportunities that they have. So do think kind of long and hard about who you do want to provide those letters of recommendation on your behalf. In terms of thinking about, though, what the piece at hand today, in terms of thinking about the timeline, since we are about 100 days out, you should be having those conversations now in terms of figuring out who you want to ask to write letters of recommendation on your behalf. It's not enough, though, to say, hey, we write a letter of recommendation on my behalf. It's more of like, are you supportive of me reaching my hopes, dreams, desires by attending a top flight MBA program? And I think that it's really important to make sure that you give your letter writers a couple kind of cheat sheet items, if you will, to help inform their writing. I know at Fortuna, we work really hard at developing templates to help our clients give some direction to their letter writers. And sometimes letter writers might feel like this is a very daunting process, like, oh my goodness, you're applying to 6 schools and you want me to submit 6 letters. The good news is that most schools have defaulted to a 2-question prompt. The first prompt really getting at what are your core competencies, your core skills relative to others. And then the other piece is around how you respond to constructive feedback. And so just let your letter writers know that, yes, even if you do have a number of schools, that you will do whatever you can to help prepare them best to provide letters of recommendation on your behalf. One thing I would say, though, too, Matt, is make sure letter writers know what happens. Everybody wants to know the ending of the story. And I actually have, when I calendar things for my clients, I have a calendared event of making sure you have some gratitude for your letter writers for supporting you. Applying to business school, it can cause anxiety, right? The balance of your life is in the hands of others. So in terms of surrounding yourself with people who are cheerleaders, who want to see you succeed, I think is really important. And so again, think really wisely about who you choose. Make sure these are folks who are excited about your future. If you have someone who says, why don't you just write your own letter and I'll sign it, I would move on. I would find somebody else who is really jazzed and psyched to be able to help you and write letters on your behalf, because again, that's the kind of cheerleader that you want to have in your corner during this process.
A lot of candidates, Bill, perhaps they've been working for just one company since they came out of college. Or their early career experience goes back sort of 4 years and they wonder how relevant. So they might be approaching 2 individuals from the same company. Any guidance with the sort of questions that Sharon was describing to ensure second voice really brings something distinct and fresh? Because even if it's supportive and psyched and jazzed, as Sharon describes,
right?
If the admissions office isn't learning anything new, that's perhaps a lost opportunity.
Right. So that's why the process of thinking about your recommendations really goes back to the self-reflection and what are the key elements that you want to bring into your application. So as Sharon has said, the ideal recommender is someone who is currently supervising you and manages you and knows your work really, really well. So they can focus primarily on the current state of your professional experience and the impact you're having. If your second recommender is also at the same company, you can have them talk about perhaps other things more along the lines of developing perhaps relationships within the organization, maybe mentoring other people, younger people within the company, or some of the things to do that person may know about that you do outside of work. So I had a client a year or so ago who had a very solid recommendation from their current employer, but had been very involved in a nonprofit, and they got their second recommender to be the head of that nonprofit organization. So that person brought in a very different perspective from the one in the professional in the workplace, and that combination, they really complemented one another and gave a full rounded picture of the candidate, and I think was very, very effective. So thinking about what do you want each of those recommenders to say, whether they're in the same company or you've got someone from outside the company, and through the templates that we typically use, highlighting what we would like each of those recommenders to say can be very powerful to make sure that they complement one another.
And
right. One of the things that I love about these Fortuna webinars that we do together, the more expertise and insights that both of you share, the more questions then come in. And it's great because some of those questions, it's like, Bill just answered that one, and I can click as I'm trying to keep all of them going. Do keep sending in the questions. We'll also try to get through some of them at the end. Here's just a quick one for you, Sharon. Submitting more than 2 recommendations, would you advise it? I mean, there has to be a good reason for going beyond the school's guidelines. And I know you're giving us a great answer, Sharon, but you're on mute. So we want to hear the voice. There we go.
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry guys. Do not submit more letters of recommendation than what has been requested. You do not want to look like that person who thinks that rules do not apply to you. However, I would say if you do have, you're lucky if you have a number of people who would like to help support your MBA application process, perhaps put some of those people in your back pocket. Should you be moved to a wait list somewhere in the process, usually schools will allow you to submit additional letters of recommendation. So hang on to some of those people. But in terms of the immediacy of having 2 letters of recommendation, just as Bill and Matt were talking about, I think it's important when you do winnow it down to the 2 people, if you have kind of 5 people waiting in the wings, I would pick the 2 people who can show both sides of the coin, if you will. So someone who can really speak to your intellect, someone who can speak to your academic preparation to do great work at a top flight MBA program, your quantitative comfort, things like that. And then potentially, and Bill alluded to this a bit, someone else who can really speak to your emotional intelligence, your ability to do well on teams. A lot of schools, particularly in the States, have a huge emphasis right now on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So how have you demonstrated those tenets in your current workspace? And so I think, again, pick the two people who are really going to be able to showcase who you are from some high level perspectives.
Now, we're packing in so much information into one webinar on Fortuna's YouTube channel. If you look up letters of recommendation, look up resumes, or of course, our next subject, which is the essays, lots of individual sessions with Sharon, with Bill, with other colleagues from Fortuna. But we started with the resume and then filling in the color in the white spaces of that resume with the voices of those recommenders. Presumably, Bill, if a recommender is really capturing the essence of your professional performance, is the essay then maybe in some cases an opportunity to share a more personal story about a path that you've taken, choices that you've made? How do you like to frame sort of setting up and digging into the essays?
Well, it really depends on the school, Matt. As I think most of our listeners probably know, the essay questions at each school can vary quite a bit. So you have the Stanford question, what matters most to you and why? You have the HBS question, which is basically, tell me what you think we ought to know. And then you have the more traditional questions, why do you want to get an MBA? Where do you want to go in your career? And how is this school going to help you get there? So depending on the question, you have different opportunities to be very, very creative or perhaps a little bit less so. So a lot of that self-reflection work we talked about earlier should inform the basic narrative. What are the key things you want to communicate to your analytical ability, your intellectual curiosity, the travel you might have done around the world, your passion for the underprivileged, your interest in diversity and inclusion, whatever it might be. And you want to make sure you communicate those in some form or fashion somewhere in the application. And usually a lot of that's going to come through in the essay itself. So if you have a very open-ended essay, you want to pick up a story that kind of gives a sense of who you are, what skills you're going to bring to the school, where you want to go in your life, and most importantly, what impact do you want to have? After you get this MBA, this wonderful degree, and have had this wonderful couple of year experience, what impact do you want to have in your career and in your life? And how are you going to make the world a better place? And so thinking about those ideas and how the school is going to help you get there, I think are very important elements of most of the essays, no matter what the topic and the specific question is. Understanding where you come from, where you want to go, and how the school is going to help you get there is really kind of the overarching theme of the story for just about every school.
With that theme, Bill, and I'll take us back to the beginning of the webinar when we sort of looked at the 3.5 months between now and those round one deadlines. With everything that we've been discussing on today's webinar, it's not that there's one right answer, where you're headed and things that you've done, but it goes back to your original point of self-reflection, to really arrive at the sort of thoughtful, articulate responses. This is an example of why it really takes time to produce that sort of thinking and clarity.
Yes, indeed. It does require a lot of introspection, a lot of conversations, ideally with a coach, to help you pull out the nuggets of information or help you recognize that something that you thought was kind of a throwaway element of your life is actually quite interesting to an admissions officer, and pulling those ideas out. And so if you think about the 3 to 4 month time frame, and the first month or so being self-reflection and school research, soon thereafter is when you should begin thinking about, how am I going to craft the essay and what is the story arc I want to tell? And particularly if you're planning to apply to HBS or the GSB at Stanford, those are very generally open-ended questions. And certainly with my clients, I typically tell them, start with that one, because that is, as you think through the process of writing the Harvard essay, you're going to come up with lots of nuggets of information that will be very useful as you write subsequent essays for other schools. So, 6 weeks, 2 months is not too early to begin thinking about what's your story arc and start to bullet point out what you want to talk about in your essays.
Sharon, the two of us worked on a piece. I loved the piece that we wrote for Forbes that looked at the Haas essays, and maybe just the fact that Ernest Hemingway was in there, that, you know, that sort of that first draft. It would be wonderful if it was just a stream of Joycean conscious thought, but what Bill describes, and even how these significance. Now, how do we tell our story within word limits, and that mix of sort of creativity versus being very matter of fact?
It's an art, right? And I think that that's why working with a coach can be super helpful. With my clients, we will have brainstorming sessions around the prompts, and figuring out how the bullets that we're coming up with, how does that make sense in terms of the thread and the story that we're putting forward? I do say to my clients, though, too, with some of the essay prompts, like, take them to dinner with you and throw it out for dinner conversation among friends, among family, and just kind of start talking about this as much as possible to start then winnowing down into something that can be succinct and concise, but also very impactful. At the end of the day, and I've said this a couple times, to give our audience context, most admissions folks, when they're in the admissions reviewing season, they're reading 30 applications a day and maybe only putting 4 people forward to be invited to interview. So what is something that is going to help elicit some sort of emotional connection to you and to the person, between you and the person who's on the other side of the screen reviewing your materials? So I think, play with the questions, be creative. I always have my clients kind of just do this whole stream of consciousness when we are doing some brainstorming. Don't throw anything away. If anything, put it kind of in a Word doc parking lot, because it might be something that comes back later. But there definitely is an art to it. And I think too, sometimes, Matt, a lot of our clients don't do creative writing. They're very good at writing engineering reports, financial appraisals, things like that. So also to put on kind of this other hat in terms of being creative is sometimes a little bit daunting as well. And I think that that's why starting sooner, more sooner than later, obviously too, is just so beneficial in terms of thinking about all of these different angles and all of these different kind of kooky prompts sometimes, in terms of making sure that you are getting a good story out there to the schools for which you plan to apply.
I'm going to take your advice, and at the next dinner party I either go to or host, ask everybody, as Duke Fuku does, to tell me 25 random things about me. It could be complete chaos, but no doubt a lot of fun and very informative.
Very interesting dinner party.
With everything that we've covered, wouldn't it be? Yeah, I don't know if the food will live up to the conversation. So pulling all of this together, and maybe sort of final review. Bill, your advice, you sort of think, well, I'm confident that recommenders have done great work, happy with what the resume says. But what's the importance then of sort of knitting everything together at the end? Are we looking for sort of coherence and consistency in that final review?
Absolutely. I mean, the entire application, recommenders, resume, essays, interview, when you get to that point, are one piece, are multiple pieces of a whole, and they all have to complement one another. And ideally, each of them will, through all of those different pieces, they will highlight all of the key elements that you develop through your reflection. So they'll talk about your analytic ability, they'll talk about the impact you've had, they'll talk about the wonderful personality you have working with other people, the engagement you have with your community. And you want to communicate all of those things through the various elements. So making sure that your essays, we were talking earlier about the sailing around Croatia. Well, you maybe have one just little line in your resume, but perhaps there's an element in the essays that talk further about that and give more detail about why that was important, why that was interesting to you. So all of these different elements have to reinforce one another, complement one another. And the other thing I would suggest is to make sure that candidates at least a month ahead of time have gone through the entire online application itself to highlight and identify any other little questions that might not be obvious. So I call them hidden essays. They're oftentimes 250-word responses that also are important elements of this overall package. And to make sure that you think about those very, very short answer questions with the same diligence and attention that you spend on the big, longer essay questions.
Right. Now, all of us, Sharon, have remembered this individual sailing around Croatia.
It
So
with
clearly,
you, right?
that's a great example of what you were describing. But I feel it might be overkill if I take my application or applications to several schools to dinner party and expect everyone to meticulously read them through. How much additional input? You might have been working with a Fortuna coach, and both of you really feel that you've put together this compelling, those different pieces of the puzzle. Getting any additional input, whether from friends, alum of the school, maybe some guidelines for what can be helpful, but equally what could be too much feedback at some stage.
Oh, gee. Well, I mean, I think that if you feel like what you have written really does authentically represent how you want to put yourself out there in the world, and you feel like you've done a great job with your coach. I certainly have had clients who we've just worked together, they've submitted, and they are happy. Certainly, though, too, I've had clients who might want to have, maybe they have a friend who's a current student who takes a look at their materials and gives it a review, or they know an alum and they want to give it a review. I would say, though, trust in your coach. And I think that it's not just the one-on-one coach who you will be working with from Fortuna, but we're also supported as coaches by our colleagues who have worked at all of these top programs. So if I'm ever not sure about something, particularly maybe if I'm working with a client who is applying to Booth, I have no problem shooting Bill an email saying, hey, Bill, do you mind reviewing this? What are your thoughts? Are we hitting the right tone? And on the flip side of that, I get asked by my Fortuna coaching colleagues, all the time, can you take a look at this Haas essay? What do you think? And I think so, because we've that insight and wisdom, I think that you should have a lot of faith that you're going to be getting the best advice possible and having a really strong writing partner in your Fortuna coach.
Right.
I think it's hard because it's an attractive distractor, right? Like you can get as many opinions as possible, but at the end of the day, the opinion that really matters is yours in terms of how comfortable you feel and how satisfied you are in that work that you're going to submit.
Yeah, I think sort of that final stage by committee, and people that obviously want to contribute something, but suddenly 7, 8 different voices, maybe all looking at this through a different prism. Now, we've covered the fundamentals of the webinar, and I think with all advice that you've given and breaking it down is the greatest illustration of how everything that a candidate is putting together over the next 3 months, the importance of getting started. You talked about reaching out to recommenders to really get that underway, but not just blindly reaching out to recommenders, already with a thoughtful sense of where business school fits and how the two of you could best work together. So with Bill and Sharon, if you're okay, I'm just going to highlight perhaps just 2 or 3 of the additional questions that we had coming in, and then we'll close from there. Raj asks, in general, how many schools should one apply to in each round? Now, presumably, Bill, there's no fixed number, just 1, 8 or 9. That sounds like a lot. What's your typical guidance there?
Well, obviously it depends on how much time you have to devote to them, but I suggest generally doing any more than 3 or perhaps 4, depending on how similar the questions are in a single round, is a lot of work. So if I have a client that wants to apply to 5 or 6 different schools, I'll say, let's break that into 3 for round 1 and 3 for round 2. And let's then strategize which ones go in each round. Because doing all of this work, the reflection works for lots of schools, but the actual essay writing still takes up quite a bit of time, and you want to devote the appropriate time to it.
Kellen is currently deployed overseas with the military, and thank you for the work that you're doing, Kellen. I suppose an extension of what Bill is describing, Sharon, thinking that it might be a bit of a rush to prepare for round 1 and applications that would be stronger in round 2. Advice, I mean, fundamentally, it's putting together a great application, whether that's round 1 or round 2. They certainly have no intention of applying in round 3. So they're asking, is applying solely in round 2 too much of a risk?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, you're completely a viable applicant in round two. Round two tends to be, for all of the programs, the largest round anyway. So you will not stick out like a sore thumb if you did not apply in round one. I mean, obviously, some of the competitive advantage of round one is no seats have been offered yet. But if anything, though, and Matt, maybe you can agree or disagree with this, but I do think that maybe one of the benefits of round one is that I think that schools are more likely to waitlist people versus doing a lot of outright denials to see then what the pool is going to look like in round two. So I don't think that you're at a huge competitive loss if you target round two. Particularly too, I think schools will be very gracious, understanding that if you are overseas and you're in the military and you're very busy, it would make sense, if you've been really caught up in what you've been doing within your military service. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. But I would agree though too, round three is out of the question though. I mean, at that point, most seats are gone. So I think if you need to target round two, it is what it is, in the sense that you don't want to rush a couple applications just to feel like you're ticking a box to get some applications in for round one. The worst thing that you could do is submit work that feels a little bit slipshod, not finessed the way you would want it to be. So I would wait till round two if that's what you need to do.
Right, so that emphasis always on quality, the best possible application. Perhaps my one addition, and we discussed this at length in last week's masterclass, that was looking at sort of trends for the 2022-2023 admissions cycle. Often applications to business school that are counter-cyclical. Right now we have a very strong and tight job market in the US. Schools are expecting to see lower US domestic application volume in round one. At the same time, with the Fed talking about interest rate increases and Goldman Sachs saying, hey, recession, there's every chance it's on its way. We may then see a sudden rush for round two applications, but some of those things are beyond our control. I think, Sharon, your emphasis on, whether it's getting a stronger test score, but most of all, putting together that's the fundamental. Now, Bill, one of our attendees hopes to get promoted next year, and I hope for them that is the case. Right. But it means that they don't want to ask their direct manager. They will be looking perhaps to somebody else. In fact, they're thinking about someone that's overseeing the company's women employee resource group that the person is part of. Does that make sense? And would you have to explain why you haven't asked your direct manager, or schools already sort of sensitive to that?
So I think Sharon touched on this a little bit earlier in our conversation. Yes, there are places where you oftentimes are asked specifically, if you did not use your direct supervisors or recommender, tell us why. And there's a logical, reasonable explanation for that that you can share, and your coach can help with coming up with the right wording for that. So finding someone else who knows your work well and can speak to your capabilities, again, thinking about which capabilities do you want this particular recommender to highlight, whether that's your analytics, your intellectual curiosity, et cetera. You can certainly find someone else to take that role, but you will invariably want to explain why it wasn't your direct supervisor. And most people will understand why that's the case. And, you kind of go with that and hope for the best. And if you get the opportunity to explain later on after that promotion comes in, you can add that as a supplemental bit of information for the admissions committee.
Right. Sharon, the last question for you, and obviously with your added coaching skills around the Clifton Strengths Assessment, Wissam is asking, could you give a school that assessment for them to then be reminded what core competencies they have?
I don't think a school would necessarily review it. I do think that there might be a way to pepper in some of the key takeaways from your own profile in some of the essays, and or should you be invited to interview, or when you are invited to interview, there are some great ways of using kind of some of the at the ready language embedded within your Clifton Strengths Insight report that you would be able to bring out in an interview setting. But I wouldn't submit the entire report to a school, particularly particularly because schools, I think, are very sensitive to having a level playing field in terms of things that they ask to be submitted. They really don't want a lot of extraneous materials coming in, hence why we also gave the advice of don't just arbitrarily submit like 3 extra letters of recommendation, kind of follow their guidelines in terms of what they're asking you to submit.
Now, with the many viewers that we've had, that number hasn't wavered in the last hour, and I really attribute that to both of you, Bill and Sharon. For some of you, for Troy, for Jessica, Hikmat, for Wissam, lots of other questions. We did get through many of them, but of course, the opportunity to talk with us directly. If you're looking at the early decision process at a school like Columbia, you know, it's unusual among the M7, it has rolling admissions and then this opportunity before the first week of October to apply. Well, reach out, let's talk about it. And as I said at the beginning of the webinar, we take those conversations very seriously, going through the resume, the sort of guidance that Bill and Sharon gave earlier. It certainly serves me very well as I look forward to the conversation that we will have, and all of the resources on the YouTube channel, on Fortuna's website. I think our team has probably blogged on every aspect of applying to business school, and then of course the schools, the personalities that fits in with comments that Bill made about personality of schools and fit. So thank you for sharing this session with us. Next week, as I said, it's the 3rd in our masterclass series. It's at Wednesday noon East Coast time, but for today, Bill, Sharon, thanks for being with us, and we look forward to connecting with all of you candidates to business school very soon.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Matt. Good talking, Sharon. Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
We're out.